When was the last time you saw a Honda car on the street? Probably very recently. Depending on where you live, every second or third car or every fourth or fifth car might be a Honda. Now, this brand we know today as Honda was not always known for making cars. As a matter of fact, the company rose to prominence by manufacturing motorcycles. What does this have to do with 80/20? In today's episode, we're going to be talking about Peter Palchinski's three principles and how Honda used them and how you might use them to create more value, to rise above competition, and to ultimately do more by doing less. So let's get into it. All right off the bat, what are Peter Palchinski's three principles? We'll talk about who Peter Palchinski is in a second, or was in a second, and how those principles applied to Honda in their history. But let me just give you the bottom line up front. The three principles are: number one, innovation, also known as experimentation. Number two, survivability. And number three is feedback. The connection to 80/20 of Peter Palchinski's principles is that you always want to be creating value, as we know in 80/20. You want to be creating that value with less effort, ideally. And of course, it's not valuable if nobody considers it valuable. So you want to be creating that value in a way that gives value to others so that you can derive value for yourself. This is exactly what Peter Palchinski's principles helps us to do. Now notice I call them principles. These are principles, not steps. It's not the first step is innovation. Second step is no. These are principles that often work together as part of your approach to value creation that gives you the best chance of success. So let's talk first a little bit about Honda, where we started the story. So in the late 1980s, or I think it was in the early 1980s, Honda was the world's leading manufacturer of motorcycles. Then comes Yamaha. Yamaha opens up the biggest factory in the world for manufacturing motorcycles and essentially declares corporate war, right, on Honda. Honda applied these three principles in a very strategic way to not only fight Yamaha, but ultimately crush Yamaha in that corporate battle, to the point where the president of Yamaha had to openly and publicly admit defeat at the hand of Honda. How did Honda do this? Really what we're doing is we're exposing the playbook of industrial engineering that applied in those times and applying it to our lives today. We are still in a world of value creation. And if we can adapt those principles from that time that worked so well to us, the new commodity is intellectual. The new commodity is software. The new commodity is ideas. If we can apply those principles to our own world, we will find it to be extremely useful and powerful. Right, so with that out of the way, let's get further into this. How does this relate to 80/20? Imagine if you could apply these principles, create more value for yourself through the three principles, create more value for others through the three principles, and increase your ability to do so in the process. Now you're getting into a concept that is not unlike the evolutionary theory of ideas that Richard Koch puts forward in his book Beyond the 80/20 Principle, where he says ideas evolve much like organisms evolve. An idea needs a certain number of iterations for it to attain to its true fit with the environment, but I'm getting ahead of myself here. What happened with Honda and Yamaha as a blueprint for how you and I can create more value? So here's Honda going along, being the world's leader, being the world's best. Yamaha shows up, challenges Honda. There were a few things Honda could have done. Honda could have built a bigger manufacturing facility to directly compete with Yamaha, but Honda did not do that. Honda applied one of the first principle of Peter Palchinski, one of the first of Peter Palchinski's principles of value creation, and that first principle is innovation or experimentation. Now, who was Peter Palchinski, first of all? I think it's important to lay that groundwork. Peter Palchinski was a Russian engineer. It seems we talk a lot about old 19th century engineers on this show. We had Pareto himself, right? Pareto principle of Pareto principle. But here's another guy for you, Peter Palchinski. Peter Palchinski developed these principles while working in Russia and overseeing the work of the miners there. He found these principles to be important for value creation at the time. You can check out the history of Peter Palchinski. I'll have a link in the show notes if you want to check out some literature, some writing about that. But the point is, he came up with these principles, and not unlike a lot of valuable principles, they ended up being applied outside of his country from where he came up with them. So the Japanese companies like Fujifilm and, of course, Honda, they've applied these principles with great success over the course of time. Principle number one of experimentation, innovation, being open to iteration. How did Honda do this? Leading up to the challenge of Yamaha to Honda, Honda had all of about 60 motorcycle models. As part of their strong response to Yamaha's challenge to their leadership in the motorcycle industry, Honda, over 18 months, a year and a half, Honda released 113, if I'm not mistaken, models of motorcycle. Just think about that for a second. In 18 months, for a manufacturer to release 113 models, it's really impressive. But that tells you that it wasn't by accident. Honda put a lot of effort and intention and resources behind flooding the market with different models of motorcycles. We'll get to some of the strategy behind this when we talk about survivability and feedback, the other two principles of Palchinski. But keep that in mind here. Honda was not afraid to try new things. Honda really changed the face of the motorcycle industry by introducing so many models, and Yamaha simply could not keep up. How does this apply to you? How does this principle apply to you? The first principle of innovation and experimentation. I think as human beings, we are averse usually to experimentation because experiments can fail, and we're often afraid to fail. But to produce the best things, often failure is necessary. It kind of comes with the territory, this thing called failure. And the best way to illustrate that I can think of is what I call the potter's paradox. I don't know if you're familiar with the story, but the story goes that there was a pottery class, and the teacher of the class split the class into two groups. Let's call group A the quantity group, and group B, let's call them the quality group. So in the quantity group, they had one task. By the end of the class, by the end of the session or semester, they were supposed to hand in as many pots that they had made as possible. And the person with the most pots, supposedly they would weigh their pots, and the person with the greatest poundage or something would get the highest grade. So that's the quantity group. The quality group, we're going to present only one pot, but that pot had to be of the highest quality, and then the highest quality pot would get the highest grade. So off the students went to work. The quantity group was crushing it, producing pots, as many as they could, practicing. They had to be finished pots, but they made so many pots. And the quality group went to town trying to make the perfect pot they could. Come end of semester, so the story goes, the instructor or the teacher compares the output from both groups. The quantity group had a huge number of pots made, and the quality group, of course, had a handful of pots. Each person had one pot. But what was surprising was the quantity group not only had more pots, but their pots ended up being of higher quality than the quality group. Well, what does this mean? This tells you that the process of iteration, of making pot after pot after pot after pot after pot, refined the quantity group's ability. And so they ended up not only making more pots, but they ended up making better pots. Whereas the other group who was trying to make the perfect pot ended up making maybe a decent pot, but not as good as if they had had many goes at making the pots. What does this tell you and I? It tells us that it's really not the most effective way to go about value creation if you just, maybe let's say, lock yourself up in your room and do the thing until it's perfect. It's tempting when you work in knowledge work to do things that way. But we know from this story, from this parable, that you're actually better off iterating many, many times, improving with each iteration. Now, depending on the kind of work you do, that may or may not be easy, but there are creative ways you can approach it. Software engineers know this, right? You release an alpha, then a beta, then another beta. You keep testing the software until it works. Now, if I've given the game away, you might recognize this as being part of feedback, which is the third of Palchinski's principles, but we'll get into that later on. But the most important thing for us to keep in mind is the first principle of experimentation or iteration or innovation. You constantly want to be innovating. This is also related to a concept which I call meta work, which is working on your work. When you adopt this mindset, it affects how you even approach your work, because part of what the quantity group, I suspect, for those potters must have found is, oh, if I do it this way, I get this result, and it's faster, or it cures faster, or it cures in a more structured way, or if I paint it with this kind of paint, it's a different effect than if I mix these two paints. So going forward, I'll mix these two paints, etc., etc. You tend to get better at the work. Your meta work practices improve when you adopt a mindset of innovation, experimentation. Still on this point, before we move on from this principle, is the concept of evolution, the evolution of ideas. Richard Koch writes about this in the book Beyond the 80-20 Principle, where he makes a very let's say, exhaustive, but for me, not particularly convincing argument on how ideas evolve like organisms evolve. If you're interested, I'll have a link to that book in the show notes as well. Very fascinating argument, but he does make a very important point there, which says that organisms evolve based on the environment. So if an evolutionary trait shows up in an organism that doesn't quite match the environment, that organism is not going to make it. And then the organisms that do make it are the ones who are somewhat matched to the environment. I agree. The same can be said for our ideas. The ideas that match the best to the environment are the ones that tend to stay and the ones that become successful. But here's the thing. We don't know what those ideas are until we put them out into the environment and see how the environment reacts to them. So whether you're a business, a freelancer, a worker in an office, getting comfortable with putting new things out and seeing how the environment responds to them, it can be a superpower if we can just overcome that fear of failure, that fear of trying something new, because you realize now that the payoff of the success of that thing far outweighs the setback of a little failure. Because remember, every failure bears with it the third principle, which is feedback. So the first principle there is innovation and experimentation and the evolution of ideas. Second of Palchinski's principles is survivability. So we've seen how Honda used that innovation and experimentation to flood the market with new models that gradually stole market share away from Yamaha. The other thing Honda had going for them was survivability. Now, this one's a bit tricky because Honda was actually on the verge of launching into the automobile industry when Yamaha's challenge came up. So it was a tricky position for them to be in. But Honda had the resources to launch this assault, if you will, to fight this corporate battle with Yamaha. That is very important for individuals as well. When we try new ideas, we must try them within the context of our ability to survive. You never want to compromise your survivability in the pursuit of innovation. You see people do this all the time. They bank all their energy, all their resources, and I mean by that your money, even your everything you have, banking it on one idea or one experiment is really unwise. So Palchinski says the second principle is survivability. No matter what you try, no matter how innovative you want to be, make sure that you are able to survive the failure of that experiment. If you assume that experiment fails woefully, can you pick yourself back up? This plays out even in our careers as well. You don't want to take career risks that could ruin you. You don't want to take career risks that could destroy you. You want to do things that are, that are expansive, that are pioneering, but you want to have enough in the tank so that if those things end up being catastrophic failures, you are not completely wiped out by that result. So you certainly don't want to ignore survivability. And survivability for the individual, for the companies, it looks something like, corporate corporate brand strength. It looks like financials, of course. There are different aspects of survivability for companies. The biggest one, of course, is often financial. And that is true also for the individual. You don't want to make financial decisions in the pursuit of innovation or experimentation that wreck you. You don't want to make investments that wreck you. Warren Buffett is a big believer in this. You don't put all your eggs in one basket, and you definitely don't put your eggs in baskets that you don't understand. So when it comes to value creation, keep survivability top of mind. But there's another aspect of survivability that applies to the individual, my dear listener, that a lot of people don't think about, and that is your physical health. Sometimes people get very lopsided in their lives where they invest so much of their energy into one aspect of their lives, or so much of their energy into one type of investment or one pursuit or one innovation or one experiment. And then there's nothing left for the other parts of their lives. There's nothing left even for them to enjoy physically. So I want to just add this little note here for you, my dear friend, that you take care of yourself. You are your best asset. The whole game ends if you end, right? You have to survive to play. And surviving to play means that you are putting time and putting effort and reinvesting in yourself, in your health, in your wellness, also in your own learning, so that you can survive if things don't quite go according to plan. You really don't want it to put a dent in your life if possible. Some bets, some innovations there'll be more riding on them than others, but ultimately you want survivability to be top of mind. And speaking of survivability and being healthy and maintaining your energy, that brings us to this episode's sponsor, which is Magic Mind. Magic Mind is a 2-ounce productivity shot, the first productivity shot of its kind in the world, that contains a combination of nootropics, adaptogens, and immunity boosting agents that is personally for me the best productivity cocktail that I've ever had. I've been using Magic Mind for over 6 months, and over time Magic Mind has come to replace my morning coffee. And not only does it contain less caffeine than coffee, but because of its proprietary blend of cognitive boosting agents and adaptogens, Magic Mind not only gives you a boost, but it also helps you stay calm, and it's been a powerful elixir for my overall well-being. It's become a big part of my morning ritual. Now, I'm recommending Magic Mind because I've tried it and I've enjoyed it. And if you'd like to try Magic Mind, dear listener, Magic Mind is hooking us up with a 20% discount for your first order. If you go to magicmind.com/8020productivity, that's magicmind.com/8020productivity, put in the discount code PRD20, that's P for Peter, R for Robert, D for Daniel 20, to get extra 20% off whatever they have going on there on a 30-day subscription. The company is so sure you will love it that they are promising money back guarantee if you ask for your money back within 30 days if Magic Mind doesn't happen to work for you, and you don't even have to send the products back. So again, magicmind.com/8020productivity, PRD20 at checkout for an extra 20% off your 30-day subscription to Magic Mind. So survivability. How did this play out for Honda? Honda needed to survive. Some of the papers I read about this YH war, the Yamaha Honda war of the 1980s, says that Honda actually took a big hit financially from having to compete with Yamaha, but they had to deal with this threat because they needed to have their motorcycle business going while they build out the motorcar side of the business. But it wasn't without cost. But they survived because they were able to measure the resources they assigned to this war in a way that it didn't threaten the entire business. So whatever you do, whatever experiments you conduct for creating value, make sure that survivability is top of mind for you as a core principle. All right, let's keep going. What's the last one? Feedback. Now remember, we started at the beginning by saying that these are principles. These are not steps. So it's not like the first step is do the experiment. The second step is, make sure you survive, by the way. And the third step is, by the way, gather feedback. They're all integrated. You're doing all three at the same time. You're experimenting with the base of survivability at the back of your mind. And here's where it really starts to make a difference is feedback. I like to say feedback feeds growth. If you're doing things, if you're attempting things, if you're investing in things and you're trying things, but you're not getting feedback, the odds are in favor of you repeating the same mistakes. Personally, I think that it's best to focus on one aspect of feedback at a time. So if you go back to the potter's paradox, like I like to call it, perhaps the first time the quantity group made a pot, they focused on getting the mixture of the clay, let's say, correctly. And then they did that a few times, got that right. The environment gave them the feedback, okay, this is a good mix of clay. Then they got into maybe the spinning of the wheel and shaping the pot. Maybe that was the next thing. They got feedback by doing that. They understood what works there. And they kept going and going and going until they were able to make beautiful pots. But if you look at the stack of pots they made to arrive at that beautiful pot, that's a testament to the experimentation that it took. But they would not have improved. And this is key, because a lot of people that tell this story, they just tell the story like, oh, just keep writing the blogs, man. After a couple of blogs, one blog will explode. Or just keep making those podcast episodes. Keep making those videos. Keep writing those reports. Keep putting out that software. Keep filling the blank. And eventually, if you get the number of reps in, you'll get better. Everything, you'll make the perfect one. That, my friends, is not the case. I can tell you, even in the world of exercise, you can't just keep showing up to the gym and just doing reps and expect to get better. There's techniques to reps. Another person could come in years after you, learn the right techniques, and in a few months be making more progress than you are in anything, because they embrace feedback. Right. So never let feedback go to waste. And I think it's powerful to actively seek out feedback. This is what Honda did. And they released those models. Those models were like live, profitable experiments. Every time they'd release a model, they'd get focus groups, they'd get feedback on the model, improve it, release another one, improve it, release another one. Yamaha could not keep up. If you get very good, if you can get very good at not just experimenting rapidly, in other words, giving you ideas, many exposures to the environment so that they can evolve to match what the environment needs, whether that's in the form of your business or your job or your career or even your relationships or your personal life. If you can get good at that method at that process of iteration, get comfortable with it, right? And you do that in a way that maintains your survivability, in a way that doesn't threaten you in an existential manner. But more importantly, you do that with the focus on feedback, a focus on constantly improving with every iteration. My goodness, man, you will be light years ahead of the so-called competition. This is where the time-based competition component of Palchinski's principles come in. Because while other people might be working on one thing, you've worked on the same thing 10 times. And they're on iteration number 1, you're on iteration number 10. And with every incremental iteration, you're getting better. You're tweaking, you're improving and improving. Right? I once heard somebody say, if you think you're ready, you've waited too long to release. I'm not sure who said that. If you know, leave a comment if you're watching this video or if you're listening to this on a podcast platform. Something to that nature, that if you wait till you're absolutely ready, then you've waited too long. You want to get the ideas out, but then you want to get feedback on those ideas. You should be craving feedback, whether it's in your job or even in your relationships. A very powerful question I learned from, I think it was Jack Canfield back in the day, talks about how in his relationships, in relationships that matter to him, he would ask this question: on a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate our relationship? Very rarely would the person say 10 out of 10. If it's going fantastic, the person might say 8 or 9. And then he'd note that. And then the follow-up question is where the power really lies, which is, what would it take to make it a 10 out of 10? And then that's when the gold starts coming out. So thank you, Jack Canfield, for that insight. You can do the same. Maybe not in those words, but what aspects of your life do you want to improve on through these iterations? You write a report to your boss or the board of your company or something, get feedback. On a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rank this report or this research or this work or this software or this idea or that presentation or that song or that fill in the blank? And then the follow-up question is, what would make it 10 out of 10? Right? Oftentimes, I think we don't ask for feedback because we're kind of scared about what we're going to get from that feedback. We want people to always praise us. Praise feels good. Quote unquote, negative or critical feedback doesn't. But learn to love the critical feedback, right? It's the wind that makes the branches of the tree strong, right? It's not the beautiful sunny weather. It's the wind that makes the branches of the tree strong. When people give you legitimate critical feedback, they are giving you a gift. And what you do with that gift is important. And what you should do with it is throw it into the next iteration and improve that value vehicle even more. So I hope you found this episode helpful on Peter Palchinski's 3 principles of what I call value creation. It's really 3 principles of success in the industrial domain. But as we've seen, it goes way beyond the industrial domain into our own personal lives. I invite you to start to apply it. Pick one thing. Don't pick too many, right? We talk about doing more by doing less on this show. Pick one thing, one aspect of your life where you want to start to innovate and experiment, trying new things. Pick that thing and allocate a cost to it that does not threaten your survivability. A cost of time, a cost of energy, perhaps a cost of money. Invest some time, some energy, some money, some resources in that process of innovation. And as you innovate, crave feedback. And then use that feedback in subsequent iterations. This is a mindset that you can adopt that can really change your ability to create value and for you to outpace anyone else in your industry or in your field that's doing the same thing. This is how you win in time-based competition. This is how Honda won against Yamaha. And this is a fantastic way to live your life, the 80-20 way. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. As we always say on 80-20 productivity, remember, it's not what you know that matters, but what you do with what you know. I'll see you in the next episode. But until then, have a productive week and bye for now.